Welcome back to Cheddar Politics. The newly launched voter formation project is aimed at increasing voter participation from local elections all the way up to those elections at the top of your ballot through digital outreach and education. So joining us now to discuss this is Tatenda Musapatike. She's the founder and CEO of the Voter Formation Project. Tatenda, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the show. And if I want to get started with this. Look, if 2020 taught us anything, it's that every vote matters and you don't necessarily know where those votes are coming from, right? So the Voter Formation Project is all about getting out Black and brown voters for the first time, but not necessarily knowing how to reach those communities. How is your organization working to get them registered and get them to the polls?
Well, first off, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. The Voter Formation Project is dedicated to doing this work differently in that we're using digital tactics and long-term communication to first help convince people that they should participate in elections and then ask them to vote. I think one piece that's been critically missing from the voting infrastructure is that we don't spend a lot of time talking to people about why voting is important. And especially in communities that have historically been disenfranchised, they may not be seeing the benefits of their local governments or may not be quite understanding how the system works. So it's important to introduce and then persuade people to participate. That way they fully understand the benefits and why they should continue to vote for the rest of their lives.
So Tatenda, a lot of this is an education initiative, right? Sort of informing people about why their voice matters. So often in this particular political journalism beat, we hear from people out on the campaign trail in all walks of life who feel as though their voice doesn't matter, that their vote doesn't matter, that it's just one of, 100 million votes, especially at the top of the ticket. So what are the ways that you're sort of informing people that their votes do matter, that their voice is important and that they should show up on election day, or frankly, in the several, hopefully, weeks of early voting beforehand?
Yes, well, there are two kinds of messages that can reinforce this. The first is understanding that not only national elections matter, but local elections matter. And sometimes those votes or the differences in those elections are small margins. It can be 1, 2, 10 different votes that make the difference of who wins an election. But then secondarily, showing the impacts on the community. I think at a national level, we can see that if it were not for the Georgia elections being won by the Democratic senators, there may not be these $1,400 checks that people just received and are continuing to receive, not to mention all of the other benefits that have come with the COVID relief packages. So it's important to both let people know what can happen on the federal scale, but also at the local election level, and for people to understand that every difference matters. Both the 2020 and 2016 elections were won by a fraction of a percentage. And that's such a tiny margin when you think of what the impacts are for the entire country or even down to your local school district.
So you mentioned Georgia, and I want to dig in on Georgia a little bit. I couldn't have you here without asking about the new voting rights legislation in the Peach State, of course, generating a lot of concern among more progressive activists in the voting space. And why are those concerns coming up? Is it a voter suppression effort, or is it sort of just making sure voting is more secure, or is it somewhere in the middle? And frankly, what do you do now that the rules have changed? You have a new rule book to work with. How do you move forward from this?
It's critically important to remember the context under which these laws have been passed. We had historic turnout across both sides of the aisle in our country in a larger election. And yet, unfortunately, one party has decided that that means that we need to try and reduce the number of people who can vote and make it more difficult. As Americans, it's critically important to understand that voting should be easy. It should not be difficult. We should not be struggling to vote at our local precincts and stand in line. It should be convenient. And so laws that make it so that it's harder for people to access the ballot box, whether it be through reduced numbers of drop boxes in their counties, whether it be through reduced hours or days of early voting, whether it be through reduced means to even make standing in line less comfortable, all of those are means through which we disenfranchise people. We have to remember that not every person has an ID, and identification can be hard to obtain, especially for people who may have lower incomes. And so every single one of these efforts that is based on a lie about unsafe elections or unprotected elections or unfair elections drastically reduces people's ability to go to the polls, which is un-American. It's not something that we should be proud of, and it's not something that should be a part of how we administer our elections.
You know, Tatenda, in 2020, our election numbers were so high. They were historically high, right? The two candidates in the presidential ticket got the most election votes of any two candidates in history, Joe Biden getting the most and Donald Trump getting the second most. Looking forward to 2019 is sort of a smaller year, right? We have Virginia State, but looking ahead to 2022, this is going to be sort of your first big moment with the voter formation project. What are your goals? What are you hoping to accomplish when it comes to getting people to the polls in an election that generally sees smaller turnout anyway, because it's between presidential years?
The mission of our organization is to decrease the disparities between people of color's rates of voting and their white counterparts. So a win for the Voter Formation Project is having more people of color turn out in their local elections and understand how the process works. Our goal through that process will be to continue to educate people in each of their states, in their local areas, about how it is that they can register to vote and how it is that they can get to the ballot box, because we have to remember that these laws look different state by state, as you mentioned a little bit earlier. And so for us, we just want increased voting. We don't have a stake in the outcome. We just want to make sure that we are starting to right the historical disparities that we've seen.
Thank you so much, Tatenda. That's Tatenda Musapatike, founder and CEO of the Voter Formation Project. We really appreciate your insight.